Hi, everyone. I'm Ellie Dehoney, and I am pleased to say hello and to welcome you to this week's Alliance member virtual meeting. As always, thank you so much for your partnership and your participation in the Research America Alliance. It's so meaningful for our advocacy and policy work. Before I introduce our special guests, just a couple of quick housekeeping matters. We're using Zoom webinar, and so right now all audience members are on mute. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, if you wouldn't mind using the raise hand feature, the electronic raise hand feature at the end of the discussion, we'll unmute your line for that question, or type your question anytime into the Q&A box, and we'll get to it after Becky and Anna finish their presentation. So with that, let me get to introductions. I'm just thrilled to introduce Becky Williams, the Acting Director of ClinicalTrials.gov, and Anna Fine, who's the Deputy Director of ClinicalTrials.gov. We have been working with Becky and Anna for a while now on the idea of modernizing ClinicalTrials.gov in several ways that patient organizations and others have been working collaboratively with the National Library of Medicine on for a while in terms of access and other issues. And so today we're going to get an update from Becky and from Anna. And with that, I'd love to just turn the mic over to Becky.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ellie. It's really wonderful to be here and speaking to this group today. And I'm glad to have Anna join me as well. I'm doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the talking today, but Anna has certainly been instrumental in all of the things I'll be discussing, and she'll be able to answer just as many questions as I will as well. I'm going to work on getting my screen shared here. And as I was preparing for this talk, I was reflecting on the last time I think I had talked to this broader group was back in December of 2019. And it just made me reflect on how much both the world has changed since that time period, as well as how much has changed sort of within our own program to be evolving to that external environment, but also to be staying on track with our modernization efforts. So even though the bulk of my talk is around modernization, it just really feels difficult to be talking about anything today without mentioning COVID-19. And I'm going to just talk about that a little bit too, because I think it's the first time where I've ever really experienced the entire public really appreciating and engaging with the role of clinical research in this new way. And I think really appreciating the role of ClinicalTrials.gov in that context as well. And so it's just such a good opportunity to be learning and reinforcing some of these important principles. So it's just a really good case study to touch base on. And then alongside that, the topic has been at the forefront in terms of diversity and equity and inclusion. And you'll see that as a couple themes in different areas of this talk. And I just call out one particular issue, and then that'll get reinforced as well. It's a real priority of NIH and other public health agencies during this time. And then that all leads us very nicely into the modernization efforts, which I'm hoping to have the most discussion on because we really do need this organization's input on some of our next steps moving forward. And this is just such a great opportunity to be able to have some of that discussion. I'll note that we have right now over 3,500 COVID-19 related clinical studies listed on the site. These are both studies within and outside of the US, with studies outside the US making up the biggest portion of them. I'm also highlighting here that we are also giving visibility to an additional 2,500 studies that are in the WHO Clinical Trials Registry portal, but that aren't listed on ClinicalTrials.gov. That's through a separate view, and that was primarily because the portal isn't working correctly right now in terms of search functions, and so we wanted to be able to give a way to elevate that. And I think there's a lot of benefits that I'll sort of go into in terms of having the system already ready-made for this type of crisis. But the other thing is that it really has been serving as a tool to support getting out information quickly about these studies. Most of the study registrations are being processed within 2 business days, so that information is getting posted to the public site relatively quickly, following all of our standard quality control review processes. And then we've been able to expedite results processing as well, so that all of those study records are getting processed within 1 week. Usually it's about 1 month for processing of results information. And then all of the information, that we have available continues to be widely accessed by users. But as I was saying in the introductory remarks, I think it's never been so clear and so obvious to so many people the benefits of having a widely available system that supports listing of clinical studies and supports the dissemination of results information. And always at the first and forefront of all of these efforts is the patients and the participants. That's always the first bullet on the slide, because it's so important to really ensure that we are meeting the commitment that we make to research participants by disseminating information in a way that can truly advance science. And so the other aspects, related to the system, again, all just become so much more clear in the context of COVID-19. And I know these are very familiar and dear to the audience, but it's just worth reinforcing sort of that the role of transparency and really contributing to and increasing public trust in the clinical research enterprise, which we know, again, is a topic at the forefront of everyone's minds. This is just to show the overall impact of COVID-19 related studies on ClinicalTrials.gov. At the same time that we saw kind of the rapid rise in studies being listed on our site, we also saw a similar drop in the rate of new studies that were coming online to be registered. And this has been sort of, I think, well anecdotally documented in terms of the impact on research operations at many organizations and institutions. Obviously, personnel being taken away to focus on COVID-19, but also, again, just not being able to be present has had such a big impact on clinical research operations overall. We have added links so that people can, as easily as possible, find the COVID-19 listed studies. We reinforce many of the NIH resources that are available in this space. And then we've also been just playing with some different views of this data as well. That's sort of the last link in the box on the right, where you can look at the COVID-19 studies by region or by the type of intervention that's being evaluated to get a little bit better look at some of the landscape related to these studies. I think also at this time that the COVID-19 pandemic has really reinforced the role of needing to connect all these different information research products to be able to more easily find information. And we've always viewed ClinicalTrials.gov as an informational scaffold. And again, through this crisis, it's really been reinforced as the need to have central information by then which you can discover all of the research products that are coming so quickly off of any one single clinical trial. One of the efforts that the National Library of Medicine has undertaken in terms of aiming to, again, advance dissemination of research was to also begin indexing within PubMed Central preprints. And so traditionally, only those publications that have followed the traditional peer review process are indexed in PubMed, but recognizing the needs within the pandemic have been doing this pilot project related to preprints. And again, in that scaffold model, we're connecting ClinicalTrials.gov study records to the information that's available within preprints if they relate to a study record on ClinicalTrials.gov. And then I think the other real benefit that we've seen during this time too is that it's really difficult sometimes for us as a government agency with also a primary focus on your already existing baseline of business to quickly adapt and innovate to meet very specific needs. And we think that one of the goals in general of the site is to make sure that our information is easily accessible, easily findable, so that others have the opportunity to really innovate as quickly as possible, but then also to be able to better tailor resources to their particular communities. And I think this is especially important also when we think about the modernization effort and the roles of so many of the different patient advocacy organizations and how they organize and are able to structure and customize information for your own patient communities. And this model is something that's really important to us in moving forward as well, to ensure that organizations have the tools that they need to better serve each of your own communities in this space. Again, during COVID-19, the topic of racial equity and ensuring that the clinical research enterprise is really demonstrating and responsive to the needs of the wide range of people that are represented here in the United States has really come to the forefront again. And there's a lot of publications already that exist describing this in many different areas of research. And again, it's at the forefront within COVID-19 research, especially because of how these populations have really been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And so I just wanted to bring light to one small thing that ends up being pretty significant in the grand scheme of things in terms of ClinicalTrials.gov, in that many of you may recall we had to go through this rulemaking process as we were trying to turn the law into regulations that then could really concretize the requirements for data submitters, again, in service of all of the users who rely on the information. And one of the things that was not previously required, but we were able to add as a requirement within the regulations, was to mandate the reporting of both race and ethnicity information within the baseline characteristics table when results are reported. So now, by design, any study that's reporting results to ClinicalTrials.gov kind of post this regulatory period is required to provide information, at least on the makeup of the population that was part of the trial. We did just a small analysis to try to understand, what the scope was before and what the scope was after we implemented that requirement. This is just a view of what the baseline characteristics table looks like on ClinicalTrials.gov. This is really equivalent to Table 1 in a journal article, if you will. And what we found was that before we had the requirement in place, less than half of the studies reporting results included any information on race and ethnicity. And so obviously, once you put a requirement into place, then people have to comply with that requirement. And what we found was that about 91% of the studies had information reported. The additional 9% were studies that did not collect information on race and ethnicity, so there was not information to report. So it's just a small example of how sort of a legal and regulatory requirement can go a long way in improving at least the ability to have insights into particular problems. And you can see that again in publications, the number of publications that reported race and ethnicity was about 62%. So by having this as a requirement within a system, it is really reinforcing that reporting. And we'll come back to a couple themes on this throughout the modernization process. But modernization is really what I was asked to come and talk to you all about today. And again, as I was reflecting on the last time that I talked to this big group, it was just as we were beginning to kick off this process. And so it was kind of an awkward time, but it was also good timing so that we could kind of prime your organization to be helping us with some of the outreach that we needed to be happening shortly after we had talked. And we're kind of in that same awkward phase right now. But again, we'll have some good things to talk about for the next stages coming up. But really the whole goal of modernization is to ensure that we can deliver to the public the value that has been intended by the laws and policies that are put into place that require registration and results reporting. And so we want to ensure that we're really fulfilling that value proposition and that we are giving ourselves also a technical foundation to be able to innovate and advance well into the future. And so the way that we set up the modernization process, it's a multi-year effort. We're expecting it to span over a 4 to 5 year period. The first year, we really wanted to ensure that we had the information that we needed. And so we really focused on engagement, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in addition to focusing on engagement, we also needed to ensure that we were establishing our own organization to be organized in a way that could support such a major modernization effort. And so a lot of the things that we've been doing this last year are also a little bit invisible to the rest of the world as we're working on ensuring that we have a well-functioning machine to really support and build on our many successes in the past, but to ensure that we can advance this project forward. And then the next years moving forward really shift more to an implementation mode. But you see this life cycle diagram on the left just because thinking about the value of ClinicalTrials.gov, we really want to ensure that this process of modernization is acting in service to the entire clinical research ecosystem. And so there's a lot of different aspects to that ecosystem. And what you don't see here are sort of the all of the different user groups that are impacted. And I'll come back to that again, but there's really a very integral process here. So in terms of at least accomplishing what we had set out to do in year one, we do feel like we were able to accomplish those goals, even though we had these other new layers attached to our work amid COVID-19, as well as some other competing priorities that had come up. But we did really work to ensure again, that we had this baseline for our business processes. I'll talk in more detail about, again, the engagement because we're at this stage where we've had this very broad engagement strategy, and now we'll be pivoting to thinking about how we can continue to more directly engage with each of our different stakeholder groups. And then I said we're kind of again at an awkward phase because one of the things that we've been working on is how we're communicating our modernization roadmap with all of our stakeholders, and we're right at that phase where it's coming together, and I'll give you a little preview of that, but we haven't yet sort of turned back around to be able to get, again, more extensive input and hopefully validation of how we're moving forward with that roadmap. So a really important part of how we've been guiding our engagement process this first year was to first set up a working group under the NLM Board of Regents And they already had a set of working groups established, which is the public service working group. And so we were able to charge this existing working group with specific topics related to modernization. And again, really focused on advising us through this first year on stakeholder engagement. We had the benefit of being able to include members of the existing Board of Regents, as well as folks within NIH from the Office of Extramural Research and our Office of Science Policies. They've been really wonderful partners in all of our work, but then also being able to add external members who can speak to many of the different stakeholders and their experiences that we're aiming to be addressing through the modernization process, and making sure that we know best how to continue to engage with some of these groups. And so this has been an extremely valuable group to us with a range of different views we have represented. And so our engagement efforts kicked off with then establishing that working group. And then, as you're all aware of, the request for information that went out at the very end of last year and ran through March. And then feeding back to the public what we learned from that request for information, and then continuing to move forward with the synthesis of that information to actually be able to turn that into action and inform our roadmap for modernization going forward. And one of the things I'll be able to share with you just a little bit again today as a preview is some of the things that we covered in our last meeting with the Board of Regents Working Group on September 11th. Before we even kicked off the RFI, we made sure that we circled back with our own internal partners here within NIH to make sure that we were really understanding their needs and their communities. One of the wonderful things about NIH is all of the different institutes and centers that we have that serve a really broad range of communities. And so we wanted to make sure that we were understanding those needs. You can see here there are high-level themes that may look very familiar, and I'll just reinforce again that at the top of NIH's list as we were discussing various things was the reinforcing the importance of inclusion within clinical research, and again the role of standardized reporting to be able to really understand what's happening within specific research studies, and then to be able to look across research studies as well. So after being able to have that input, we turned that into the RFI. There were three main themes focusing on the website itself, the submission process, which is so important because everything that is submitted is what then the public website relies on. And then third, this role of data standards, because it's cross-cutting, again, across both the website functionality issues as well as the information submission issues. One of the things we tried to make clear as part of this RFI as well, because I think everyone had maybe a little bit of fatigue from the rulemaking and regulatory process, is that this RFI itself wasn't intended to focus on those legal and policy requirements, but instead to focus on how we can maximize, again, the requirements that we have in place. But that being said, there are certainly many things that do come to attention when we heard from people that do intersect with those requirements. In terms of the RFI itself and who we heard from, you can see by the diagram on the left that we had a lot of representation from researchers and others, and especially our data providers, you know, the ones who are most commonly interacting with the data submission system every day. It was a little bit harder sometimes to always understand someone's role because we didn't request that specific information. So there's a significant group that's unknown, but those that were easily identifiable as patients or caregivers or advocates are noted here. And I think one of the things that we learned from this particular outreach is really the importance of doubling down on outreach to this patient, caregiver, advocate community in our future engagement activities to make sure that they're adequately being represented in all of the comments we receive. We then turned around shortly after the comment period closed and held a public meeting to try to share pretty quickly what we learned from that RFI. And again, you can see distribution from the information that we had related to who attended that meeting. Again, sort of the others and the unknowns make it difficult to categorize. Again, the researchers and data submitters appear to be particularly well engaged in this process. The main things that we learned from the RFI focused on these two areas of website functionality and information submission. On the website functionality side, kind of obvious things, but things that are really important to reinforce, that a lot of the needs really centered around conducting and managing a search, making that search process more user-friendly and having better tools for managing search results. The other area was within the study record itself and trying to understand the study. And as I mentioned, we received comments on things that sort of extended beyond the existing requirements, including making content available that currently isn't collected, and add features to make using content easier. And then the most common theme, I would say, was really around the need for plain language information. And what was really interesting about this is it wasn't only coming from the patient and advocacy community, it was also coming from the data submitter community and researchers as well, that there's this real challenge in communicating some of the complex regulatory requirements and translating that into system requirements. And so this need for plain language, I think, is really universal and something that we really intend to take into account with all of our efforts going forward. The other category focused on information submission and had to do a lot with data structure and format. It was really interesting. There's this amazing tension between people really wanting to be able to rely on standardization, places where they might already be using standards, but then at the same time, wanting more flexibility to be able to say whatever they want to say in particular places. And so that's one of the challenges we're always facing in administering the system, is that challenge between structure and flexibility. And then the QC review process that we have in place, again, our submitters are just looking for ways to streamline that process and then also to improve their overall workflow management. I had signaled that we had recently had a working group meeting back in September, and we are in the process of continuing to kind of synthesize and finalize some of the work that came out of that meeting. But we engaged the working group in using this framework to support change. And really helping us to articulate many of the things that we heard from the RFI, but to translate this into a framework that we can use to be able to communicate with all of our stakeholders going forward. And so what we primarily focused on with the working group is how we're articulating the vision for modernization and how we're articulating the outcomes that we hope to achieve through this process. And I think a key thing to keep in mind is that, we won't be able to achieve the entire vision or the entire set of outcomes at the end of the 4 to 5 year period, but we should be well on a pathway to doing so. And we discussed the challenges then that intersect with and potentially interfere with being able to achieve this vision and outcomes. And so a lot of what we discussed is represented here. And when we think about vision, it's really, what is the future legacy we want to leave behind? And what became, quite clear from our session is how all of our stakeholder groups really view ClinicalTrials.gov as being essential to the clinical research ecosystem. And we want to ensure that we're really holding up to the standard that people expect of the system. many of the themes that came through as we were discussing the vision was a lot about sort of the need to put research in context, that just the lack of general understanding about research in general, and how to help support people in understanding what research is and what the different roles of our different stakeholders are. Again, ensuring sort of the reliability of the information itself, and restoring accountability to the entire enterprise. And you see the other themes that I introduced earlier continue to be so important, related to having trust in research and really ensuring equity and how to build that into any process. The other thing that became incredibly clear through this session is when we talk about who we want to impact, it became clear that each of the groups that you see here are really equally important as we're moving forward. Data submitters are, essential because they are the ones providing the information that researchers and patients rely on. And so much of the level of what we're able to accomplish also relates directly to how well data submitters are able to accomplish their task. And that when we, again, think about this vision, we want to ensure these groups are still represented equally. And there was this acknowledgement that even though we've simplified this into 3 major groups and categories, that there's so much heterogeneity, within each of the categories, and to begin to think about how we can incorporate that into our engagement and efforts as we continue to move forward. And so our intention as we move forward, sort of shifting from this broad outreach and engagement strategy to a more focused effort on implementation and interaction with our users, is to really make sure that our approach is user-centered, and that we are basically nimble enough to be able to learn quickly and adapt, and to be able to implement change in a steady process. And so at the center of this is, of course, being able to continue to get timely input from the users who are impacted by changes that we intend to introduce and to really improve various aspects of the system. And so here I'm describing it as user feedback loops, but this is really our intention moving forward as we kind of shift from the broad outreach approach to more directly engaging with each of those different user groups, so that we can introduce their voice into the design process and ensure that we're understanding their needs in the entire process. And so I'm sort of getting close to the end here, and I just want to plug this as a topic that I think is really important to obtain this group's input and feedback on in terms of recommendations around engaging, with your organization and other organizations in these user feedback loops. And I know in your own RFI comments that this was a major aspect of your recommendations, was really how we do continue to engage with different user types. So it seemed like a good opportunity to hear more directly from all of you in terms of what good models you've participated in, and how we might be able to learn from that. And so as we move forward in modernization, we really are shifting into a different phase where we will soon be able to share more broadly where what we think this roadmap looks like and how we can continue to engage different organizations in the process and sort of every step of the process as we move along. And so again, we're kind of in this awkward phase of shifting from one to the other in terms of the concrete information I have to share, but it's a really good opportunity for us to be in discussion about this next phase. I've included here just a reference to our ENews Bulletin. This is primarily focused on our PRS users, but we include a lot of general information as well. It's a way to stay up to date on certain things that are ongoing, especially modernization. We put updates out through this method as well. And we do have, sufficient time for discussion. But again, if you need to get in touch with me after this, contact information is here. Our general email address will get you a response within 24 hours. My response time tends to be a little bit longer than that, but they have the benefit of many people managing that particular address. So I think with that, I'll go ahead and stop and maybe turn it back over to Ellie. And I think this topic of continued engagement with users and especially patients, for this group, and your insights and input into that would continue to be very helpful.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Becky. I wanted to ask an initial question, then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Terry Schwartzbeck, who has other questions for you. I have two questions, one that came in through the chat box. But if you had to say from the summary doc, which will circulate the summary doc of comments from your public meeting, what the biggest theme was, what you saw over and over, if you did one comment, what would that be?
That's a great question. And I think what's amazing is that there were a lot of things that we heard over and over, which tells you, I think, a little bit of the challenge that we have ahead of us. But the one thing that I emphasized, I think, in the when talking about those themes, the importance of plain language information and how universal that was really striking. And I think that came up, sort of again and again, no matter what the context was. And so that, rose to the kind of the highest on that list very quickly.
Terrific. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Another question that we had that came in through our chat function was whether or not the ID number for a clinical trial is available to trial participants during the trial so that they can look back on CTE.gov if they want additional information, or whether they receive that ID number after the trial has completed. And what I'm going to ask, if this is feasible, Barbara Hansen, one of our terrific member organizations and friend, asked this question. So Barbara, if I've got it wrong, I think we can open your mic so that you can elaborate on that question. Terry, am I right there? Is that feasible to do? Or does Barbara need to press *6 or?
Hold on, let's check on that. And in the meantime, Becky, is that something you can address?
Yeah, I can address it broadly. I was actually also just quickly looking up a piece of information on my end. I think that the NCT number is the unique identifier, that we use for records on ClinicalTrials.gov. You'll notice it's a common practice. Finally, across NIH, when they have press releases or other information related to clinical trials coming out, that they will include that NCT number in those communications to be very specific about how to find that particular trial and to look at more information. I would say that the practice is really quite variable across organizations and how they use and leverage that reference to the NCT number. I think that what the question was maybe more directly related to is also when someone chooses to participate in a clinical trial, what information are they given, perhaps about the public study listing for that trial. And one of the things that is required within the informed consent form for those trials that are covered by the law is that there is a required statement in there that indicates that the trial will be listed on ClinicalTrials.gov. I think then how every IRB handles any additional information about that, again, is specific to the organization. So you'll see variability in terms of whether they're including the NCT number in the informed consent form or not. And there's actually a way to study that now because one of the requirements in the common rule is that informed consent forms for federally funded research must be made publicly available either on clinicaltrials.gov or in regulations.gov. So we now have a trove of informed consent documents associated with study records on clinicaltrials.gov.
Cool.
That would give some insights into what's happening within those study documents. And it's going to be a really rich resource for folks who are interested.
Yeah,
in
research and yeah, that's terrific. Hey, listen, I think what I'll do now, Terry, let me turn it over to you. I see that we have a number of questions coming in. So if you pop up, I'll shut off my, my video.
Sure, thanks, Ellie. We have another question that came in through the chat. Does modernization include translating the site into Spanish so that the Latinx community can have access to this information?
So that was definitely feedback that we did receive through the RFI. So it's certainly accounted for. What we're in the process now is of really working through all of the different priorities. And again, when I speak of this roadmap, beginning to look at the high level and then the lower level aspects of this. And so I can't say definitively, you know, whether it will or it will not, but it's absolutely something that is part of our consideration because of the feedback we received.
Great. And Barbara Hanson, I see you unmuted yourself. Did you want to add anything to the discussion of the identification number?
Yes, I think the question really has to do with patients and whether they really are having access to the details other than what's in an informed consent form, which is often very laypersonized, if you will, and may or may not be the full study that will actually end up in print someplace. And then I had a second question, because we're dealing with very soon the issues of vaccine testing. The Chinese have run into a problem, I hear third hand, so I can't verify this, that they need to have groups of people with a high incidence rate to be vaccinated, so they will have small enough, doable enough numbers, if you will, to get a reasonably quick response, or a quick read at least. Are we going to have that problem as well, as far as needing to locate groups like the Chinese need to locate with high incidence, current incidence?
That's a great question, and it's completely outside of my direct area of expertise. So I don't want to say anything that would be incorrect. But that is, I think, in general, a consideration around sort of exposure. What is your risk of exposure to be able to determine and assess whether it is effective? We obviously have continuing climbing cases here in the US. And I know that they have taken vaccine research to other areas with high incidence as well to be able to support that. But I basically probably know as much as you do.
Barbara, let me, I'll try to, you know, through 6 degrees of separation, get you an answer to that and shoot you an email.
Thanks.
Great. Another question we have, diversity in clinical trials. Obviously, you talked a lot about this. And you mentioned about adding race and ethnicity to reporting. Do you have a sense of sort of when that data rule will be enacted? What kind of time frame? And any other ways that this is being facilitated?
Yeah, so that went into effect in January of 2017, and it applies to any study that basically completed after that time frame. And so anyone submitting results with a completion date after the effective date of that requirement has to provide that information or provide the information to indicate that they didn't collect it.
Great. And just a reminder to those who are watching, we can take more questions through the Q&A box, so feel free to type those in, and we'll get to them if we can. Can you talk a little bit too about any issues around running trials in resource limited areas or areas that have challenges recruiting?
Yeah, so it's another area I can't directly speak to, but we're absolutely, continue to be interested in the needs of those communities. Again, sort of in our role in managing the centralized reporting process, we have less direct interaction with the actual trial conduct. It's more about the dissemination of the information related to that trial. So some of those things end up being a little bit outside of scope for us. But as we're understanding many of the issues and needs of our users, that's the type of information we're interested in so we can better understand the context that matters for different communities.
Great. And you also mentioned you'll be able to share more soon. I'm sure we're all very interested. But how can Research America and our members, how can we continue to support you in this effort?
Yeah, so that is, I think, the most important question, and really what we were interested in having more discussion with you about today too, and your ideas in that space. I think as I mentioned, we're kind of in this phase of being able to shift from a broad engagement effort to now being able to really focus on specific user groups and their needs. And as we're beginning to sort of design for those user groups, we have opportunities in which we will need direct feedback from users, kind of on a relatively routine basis. And so I think one of the questions that we were interested in from the perspective of your organization is, what is the best way to engage with you and to leverage your organization as we're seeking basically user volunteers to give us feedback as we begin to work on very specific things?
Well, it's a great question, and we are so excited to play that role. I think one of the things about our members is they step up, and so we can certainly do outreach through our weekly letter and through other means, social media and on our website, to ask for volunteers, and we'll get them, because I know this is a really important topic across the ecosystem. So count us in and just tell us what you need, and we will find a way to deliver.
That's awesome. Thank you. And a question for you on that too, because I think one of the things, as you said, people step up, and we've experienced that too, where there's such a natural interest and a desire to support this work, that then sometimes we have the counter issue where we get so many people who express interest. I wonder if you've encountered that and how you help to balance some of that as well when you have so much interest and it's hard to get to everyone.
Yeah, I think for us, whoops, did I just turn off sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear me, but I just turned off
I can hear you and see you.
Oh, you can? I just couldn't see myself. I feel like for us, Abundanza always works well. But we have 430 plus member organizations, and we just try really hard to make sure we're hearing and acting on what we, from anyone and everyone within our membership that has a view. But I agree with you that sometimes it's really hard. a lot of times what we'll do is do outreach to folks who have expressed interest and start there, and then build out through our weekly letter and other mechanisms to see if there are others who want to engage. So, but I know you guys were likely completely inundated, so we all get that. That's hard.
Yeah, and that stepwise approach seems helpful too, because then you can kind of learn what type of response you are getting, and then if you need to go broad, you really can. But sometimes you want to make sure everyone knows there is this opportunity as well, so folks aren't missing out.
Absolutely.
So on that front, the other question that I had for you, Ellie, and any of your other members is, again, thinking about how we continue to keep you apprised of our activities and efforts. I love doing, events like this. It's great to be able to talk directly to folks, but we're continuing to kind of try to understand, what methods of communication people prefer, what frequency of communication, feels right. And I was just wondering if you had any sort of general thoughts on that as well, in terms of what is most helpful as we continue to try to keep everyone up to date on this effort.
Sure. Well, first let me turn to folks that are listening in and ask if anyone could raise their hand and give feedback on that. You know me, I always have an opinion, but I'd rather hear from you all about this. Joel, are you in the audience? Not to put you on the spot. I can't see if we've got any hands raised.
Joel is not on right now, but we will check for hands raised.
Okay. Okay, well, I will, shockingly enough, I have an opinion. So I actually think on this, people are so interested, Becky, that more is better, but we also don't want to draw from your staff time that you're using on this actual project to communicate about the project. I think our members, from what we can tell, a lot of times an email, the weekly letter reaches, 4,000 plus people. But for us, emails that we send out specifically to our members with new information is real effective. And we also, on our web page, on our front page, have started putting news on. So we can help you convey information. But I've got to guess that our membership, wouldn't be intimidated by once a month, if that works for you, or some kind of update that, that is periodic but predictable in a sense, that we hear from you, on one, the third week of each month, or the once every other month. Again, I'd love to get feedback from our members. And if you all wouldn't mind just shooting me an email as you're thinking about this, I'll relate it to Becky, or you go directly, either way you'd like to do it.
And Ellie, we have Marcia Buck. Her line is unmuted.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Marcia.
Hi, I'll just respond and say that I'm really excited about the changes and the fact that you're moving into the implementation phase. As a former pediatric pharmacist in practice for 30 years, I relied heavily on ClinicalTrials.gov, particularly to write a monthly newsletter that contained a lot of information about pediatric trials. You're making that life easier for clinicians, that role easier for clinicians to evaluate what's coming up and not just what's in the literature. In my current role for the American College of Clinical Pharmacy, a member of Research America, I would just like to say that the more information, the better. I think for me, and as an organization, to get out to our 18,000 members, many of whom are involved in clinical research or are faculty in teaching results from new trials. So I think publishing and the availability of your bulletin is a great idea. I think we'll do that for ACCP to our members. I also think the Research America emails are a great method of getting out the information too. That's a very easy to read and timely email in my inbox. So I'm coming up with a few different ideas, and also really appreciate the involvement in Research America.
That's great. And I have to just say that I gave the complete wrong number for the number of folks who get the weekly letter. It's now nearly 10,000. So I just lowballed it by about 6,000. Chalk dust. But sorry,
Don't sell
sorry
yourself
about that.
short.
No, that's great. I'm thrilled that we have a $10,000, 10,000 person circulation.
Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing too, I guess from both of you, Marcia and Ellie, is sort of the benefit of predictability and regularity, sort of knowing that you'll be hearing about it at different intervals is really helpful. And sort of that method could be different things, but again, knowing when and how.
Perfect. Hey, are there other questions? I know we're heading towards the end of our time here. Terry, do you have other questions for Becky?
Not yet. Again, a reminder to folks, they can use the chat box or the Q&A box, or raise their hands and we will unmute you and let you join in.
And just to address one of the questions, I will share these slides with Ellie for sharing in whatever way you all deem appropriate.
Perfect. Okay, well, listen, what I'll do is I have 2 more housekeeping items, and you're probably so sick of hearing the word housekeeping items. I can't even imagine. But let me just mention that we have opened now a microgrant program. We are looking for proposals from young investigators who want to be involved in civic engagement. There's a slide up now, thank goodness, so that I don't talk your ear off about this. Deadline November 9, so hustle and get us your proposals in. It's really been successful in the past, these cool microgrants that lead to more civic engagement about science in English to the community. And I think there's no time like now to really build up science trust that way, just by communicating, young scientists communicating with the public. So that's one. Number 2 is our Vote Science Strong initiative. It is a nonpartisan activity that is engaging candidates on the importance of R&D and assets like ClinicalTrials.gov. And please go to our website, use our hashtag, and get involved. It's building champions now is a really smart thing because we're going to need them in the years to come. So let me stop there, and I'm going to keep this on for a minute because I see some things going into chat, some information going into chat, but you no longer will have to look at my face because I'm gonna say goodbye, and thanks again. And really, thank you so much for your membership and for your engagement. Email any of us anytime. We'd love to hear from you and want to be as helpful as possible. So, and thank you, Becky and Anna. Can't thank you enough, and we'll be in touch real soon.
Thank you so much for having us.
Okay, I think we'll end the meeting here. Thanks again. Take care, all.